This man was spot in the middle of the Tet Offensive, and indeed was lucky enough to wake up the next morning to find the most extraordinary and horrific pictures of men whose lives had been destroyed by the Viet Cong and whose faces and heads and brains and internal organs were exposed. That's what Tony Dell was exposed to. He returned, and I say he's a metaphor, he returned to Australia and said not a single thing about his term in combat. In fact, he was then picked for the final test. It's almost 49 years ago, in February it will be, 49 years since he was picked for the final, the sixth test against Ray Illingworth's England side, the Ashes. It was Ian Chappell's first test as captain, the sixth test. Dennis Lillee had made his debut in the previous test and taken 5 wickets. Ian Chappell was the new captain. He threw the red ball to Dennis Lillee at one end and to this man at the other. Why am I telling you this? Because he actually shared a room with the captain. The captain, I might say, Ian Chappell, thought, well, I thought I got a room to myself. But he didn't. He got a room with Tony Dell. At no time, at any time, did he even know this man had served. And it wasn't until 40 years later that he was comfortable about actually saying what he'd been done, where he'd been, and what he'd seen. So we're witnessing here a man who is indelibly in history, because now with the passing of the great Arthur Morris, this is the only man in this country of 25 million people, and there will be no other, who has worn the baggy green cap, the green and gold, and has worn the uniform in combat. Now, I'm staggered, really, that when we meet here today, there is not a member, I presume, of the Queensland Government. It's to your great credit, Commissioner, that you're here. There's no one here from the federal government, and nor is there likely to be. Because these are the people who foist blame on innocent individuals. But Catherine McGregor, you may have seen on my program from time to time, a magnificent scholar, one of the most extraordinary writers, cricket writers, but a knowledgeable lady from the point of view of Kay. You made a very valid point. Kay made this point, which I'll return to in a moment, that anyone can say anything about what's happened in combat. None of this is tested. The rules of evidence don't apply. They're not challenged, these witnesses, and there is no redress. And I'll come to a moment to this infamous Brereton report, and I'll come to that in a moment. And when I resume on February 1 on Sky News, I'll come to it in more detail, and it won't make pleasant viewing for the government of Australia, I can tell you. So we don't think that Christmas has come and gone. But I just come back to Catherine, who in a piece that she wrote recently for The Australian, which was a beautiful piece about you and where you've come from, but she ended by saying, I brought this with me today, she says, talking about Tony and what happened, because they had Tony Abbott, when he was Prime Minister in 2014, honoured Tony at Manuka Oval. Which was, I think, the last time you played there, and they all went out to celebrate. But Catherine McGregor made a very valid point, because not only, people say, oh, when we serve, and we're talking about post-traumatic stress, and I know that Tony often, when he's talking about it, leaves the word disorder off, because it intimidates people from coming forward. You're a dysfunctional person, you're a non-person, you're a person of disorder or disability. So we're talking about post-traumatic stress. But the consequences of these are, and Tony experienced these, and so do so many others, suddenly you don't know why, but you're aggressive in the workplace, eventually they get rid of you. You're given opportunities to work, and the same with the police force, and suddenly you behave in a strange way. So this leads to marriage breakdowns, it leads to a loss of stability, a loss of personal recognition and self-worth. So here we was at Manuka Oval with the Prime Minister, and Catherine McGregor wrote this. Monica Oval in summer is picturesque. Catherine, I know you're here in spirit. She wants to be here, but she's in Canberra. The blazing lights compete with the fading twilight to illuminate the little ground upon which Bradman himself played his very last match. After dinner, on a balmy evening in November 2014, Tony Abbott is greeting a line of well-wishers and local identities who want a moment of his time. A low hum runs through the crowd. The head table is emptied, but for a hulking, solitary figure, Tony Dell sits alone. He loathes crowds. He doesn't engage in small talk. That evening, his service and his battles with PTS have been recognised by the game he loves and by the nation's leader. But war, Catherine writes, is not a game. Tony Dell, she says, ruminates quietly, oblivious to the raucous cacophony around him. His gaze seems to be on the pitch, yet his focus seems to be elsewhere. Perhaps the images and sounds of the present will always vie with those of shadowy figures in black, moving stealthily through the jungle as his heart races as it did that night so long ago in Vietnam. She finishes. Whatever records fall this summer, Tony Dell unquestionably occupies the last post. He holds a slot in an immortal team from which he will never be dislodged. This man, as I said, the only living Australian amongst 25 million who's worn the baggy green and gold, but actually served in combat.